pleased to call this hearing to order. Where two of our witnesses are actually here in person. We have another one who's joining us from the other side of the world, somewhere. But as Rebels, we're anxious to hear from you. And Susan, just nice to see you. And Mr. Sullivan, what's your family Spanish? Where are you guys from?
We're a nice mixture.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a long story, but we speak Spanish and Lithuanian at home. So yeah.
Okay. We mostly stick with English.
I'll keep it in English for today.
All right. Well, I'm happy to call this hearing into order. We're here, as you know, to examine the implications of the Supreme Court's decision on Sackett versus Environmental Protection Agency for our nation's wetlands and streams. Our hearing is timely as today marks the 51st anniversary of the Clean Water Act. Susan's been here more than a few times, and so we know her. She's part of the family here, extended family here. We especially welcome you today, and Mr. Sullivan, and to Ms. Rebels. We're delighted that you could join us and for your contributions. While the Clean Water Act has been immensely successful at cleaning up our country's waters and slowing the loss of wetlands, the Sackett decision, in my view, has jeopardized nearly a half-century of progress under this bedrock environmental law. To understand the significance of this ruling, it's important for us to recall the state of our nation's waterways in the early 1970s. Before the Clean Water Act, our nation's waters were subject to indiscriminate pollution and destruction. Our waters were so polluted that the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio, just north of where I went to college, in Columbus, Ohio. But the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. And that was like the year after I graduated. I remember I think I was on my way to Southeast Asia with the Navy. And I remember reading about the Cuyahoga River catching on fire. And I thought, oh my God. But that was a wake-up call, not just for me, but for a lot of people in our country and a lot of people who worked here in the House and the Senate. As a result, Congress got to work. And thanks to champions like Senator Ed Muskie, a Democrat from Maine, who many of us knew, and Senator Howard Baker, a Republican from Tennessee, who many of us knew and respected both of them enormously. But Congress enacted the Clean Water Act in 1972. And in doing so, they made a bipartisan commitment to protecting and restoring our nation's waterways. The law very clearly states that its objective is to restore and maintain the chemical, the physical, and biological integrity of our nation's waters. Today, the science is clear. We simply cannot achieve that goal without protecting wetlands and streams. That's because the health of our waterways and the health of our wetlands and streams are inextricably linked. I've practiced pronouncing inextricably for hours last night, so I wouldn't mess it up. That's okay. That's all right. Your phone's probably celebrating that I know how to pronounce that word. So, well, unfortunately, the Supreme Court failed to recognize this link in May of this year, when the conservative majority upended more than 4 decades of agency practice and precedent based on the original intent of the law. And while we don't yet know the full extent of the damage from the Sackett decision, scientists estimate that more than half of our nation's wetlands no longer have Clean Water Act protection. And this loss of federal protections could have disastrous consequences for our environment and our economy. Welcome, Ben. Why are wetlands so important? In addition to sequestering carbon, wetlands act as a natural sponge that traps, filters, and slowly releases water. They help provide us with clean drinking water and protect our property and infrastructure. In fact, wetlands can store more than 1 million gallons of floodwater per acre. Let me just say that. First time I heard that, I didn't believe it. Let me say that again. Wetlands can store more than 1 million gallons of floodwater per acre. That's pretty amazing. They provide an estimated $1.2 to $2.9 trillion in prevented national flood insurance program claims each year in our country. Why is that important? Because the National Flood Insurance Program is always running out of money. and the ability to actually save and preserve some money there in that fund is important. Removing protection for wetlands is especially short-sighted as climate change continues to fuel more extreme weather events, which we witness almost daily. In Delaware, we've seen firsthand how wetlands can mitigate flood risks. After Hurricane Sandy, a few years ago, we restored degraded wetlands in communities that had long flooded during storms. And since the completion of that restoration project, many of those communities, thank God, no longer flood. Wetlands also provide irreplaceable habitat for many wildlife species, especially birds and fish, and at a time when habitat loss is one of the factors driving a global crisis of diversity loss. We should think long and hard before eliminating protections for more than half of our wetlands. The Sackett decision increased the burden of wetlands management for states. And currently, 25 states do not have laws in lieu of the Clean Water Act to protect their wetlands. And even in states with wetland protection laws, many regulators have said that they lack the capacity to issue permits for the wetlands and streams previously protected by federal agencies. Furthermore, watersheds span multiple states, which means that the actions in one state can often implicate neighboring states like Delaware and Maryland and Delaware and Pennsylvania, Delaware and New Jersey, and so forth. But even if states quickly expand their capacity to protect waters and wetlands, a patchwork of state laws would result in confusion and regulatory uncertainty. I talked with Susan a little bit about certain. One of my goals is like certainty and predictability, and hopefully when all is said and done here, we can have more of that than we have right now. But if states are left to conserve wetlands by themselves, the objective of the Clean Water Act would be unfulfilled. What's more, wetlands are only one part of the impact of the Sackett decision. This ruling also likely means that more than a million miles of streams no longer have protection under the Clean Water Act. These streams provide over $15 trillion per year in ecosystem services, including protecting and filtering water supplies. Streams that only flow for part of the year are especially vulnerable because of the Supreme Court's decision in Sackett. These types of streams play a key role in mitigating drought and protecting water supplies for communities in the western United States, particularly for tribal nations. Many of those communities are now rightfully concerned about their ability to protect these streams without federal protection in place. Let me just close, if I could, by saying that the Sackett decision, in our view, ignores science and turned back the clock on protection for our wetlands and streams. This decision puts our health, it puts our environment and our economy really at risk. For more than 45 years, no less than 8 consecutive Democrat and Republican administrations interpreted the Clean Water Act protections to be broader than they are following the Sackett decision. The need to make our nation's waters safe for drinking, swimming, and fishing was obvious to Congress in the 1970s. Today, I believe the Supreme Court got it wrong, with all due respect, in the Sackett decision. And I know that many, but means all of our colleagues agree with that. With that said, I also know there's a wide range of shareholder perspectives, stakeholder perspectives on this topic. We look forward to hearing those views from our witnesses today. Before we do, let me turn to Ranking Member Senator Capito for opening statement. Let me just say to our colleagues, we've got hearings going, all kinds of hearings going on, and votes and so forth this morning, so we'll have people coming and going, as you know. Please bear with us, if you would, Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witnesses for being here today. And it is the 51st anniversary of the Clean Water Act as we speak. So thanks for holding this important hearing to discuss the scope and implication of the Biden administration's revised Waters of the U.S., or WOTUS rule, as its failure to fully implement the Supreme Court's recent Sackett versus EPA decision. I fear this inability or unwillingness of the Biden EPA and the U.S. Corps of Engineers to follow the directions laid down by the court sets up only more regulatory uncertainty for stakeholders and the promise of even more litigation. On day one of this administration, President Biden signed an executive order to once again reopen and expand the reach of federal jurisdiction over waters of the United States. It was a solution in search of a problem, even after repeated requests that the EPA and the Corps could never identify specific examples of waters that were impaired as a result of the prior rule, and it took 2 years to finalize the new version. That is 2 years without clarity, even as Congress moved forward with infrastructure investments that would be held up by WOTUS jurisdictional determinations. During that time, EPA Assistant Administrator for Water, Radhika Fox, repeatedly promised that the Biden administration's initial WOTUS proposal would balance elements of the prior two revisions, provide regulatory certainty, and perhaps most importantly, be durable so that it could withstand legal scrutiny. The rule we ultimately got achieved none of those goals. During those 2 years of rulemaking, the Sackett case was making its way up to the Supreme Court, with every indication that a ruling would significantly affect any rule the EPA or the Corps of Engineers finalized. The administration ignored repeated admonitions from certainly me and others, as well as impacted property owners and stakeholders, that the agency should wait until the Supreme Court acted to proceed so that they could follow the court's directives. Ultimately, we were right and they were wrong. The Biden administration wasted valuable time and resources prioritizing the promulgation of a rule that was unanimously rejected by the Supreme Court for its overreach. The EPA has now done the bare minimum to revise its initial proposal in response to the Supreme Court's decision so that it could rush a direct-to-final rulemaking that avoids transparency and public input. The only reason I could see to take this pass is to keep WOTUS alive as a political wedge issue and environmental activists engaged. I fear this is setting us up for a repeat of WOTUS whiplash. To understand why, let's just go back a few months. The Supreme Court ruling in Sackett versus EPA, handed down in May of this year, represented a crucial victory for the cause of cooperative federalism enshrined in the Clean Water Act. The court correctly limited the scope of federal authority over wetlands consistent with the text of the Clean Water Act, thus reestablishing the delicate equilibrium between federal and state governments that Congress intended when it comes to safeguarding our precious water resources. Supporters of expansive federal regulation of WOTUS argue that the court's decision leaves waters unprotected, and the chairman spoke to this. That is misleading. That is not only misleading, it does a disservice to state and local governments who know their own local water issues best and have the most at stake in protecting them. It's an argument we have heard repeatedly over the past decade as the federal government embarked on 5 separate attempts to create a WOTUS rule, ramping up or scaling back the reach of federal jurisdiction and the types of projects requiring federal permits from Washington's broken regulatory apparatus. The Supreme Court's decisive ruling in the Sackett case should have put an end to this back and forth. At least that was our hope. Instead, on September the 8th, the agencies published the updated final WOTUS rule, amending the 2023 rule to allegedly conform to the Sackett decision. The agency stated that the sole purpose of the rule was to conform to Sackett and therefore used a procedural tactic that is supposed to apply only when an action allows no agency discretion and imposes no burdens on the regulated community. But that really results in is no public input or transparency into the rulemaking as it's announced in its final form. The Supreme Court's decision in Sackett did more than just abandon the old significant nexus standard for determining the scope of federal waters. The majority established a new test pulled from the Clean Water Act that fully accounts for the law's use of the term navigable waters. The agencies entirely ignored this direction, and so on both process and substance have opened themselves up, I believe, to more legal challenges, creating more uncertainty for businesses, landowners, and project sponsors, and prolonged for all of those involved the likelihood that it's going to necessitate yet another WOTUS rule in the future. This new revision to WOTUS won't even be consistently applied across the country. The update does nothing to address other issues that prompted the rule to be stayed by district and circuit courts. In 27 states, and I have a little picture here, the purple are the 27 states until we sit here. It's your state, my state, and Senator Kramer's state. In those 27 states where the 2023 rule was enjoined, the agencies will interpret WOTUS consistent with the pre-2015 regulatory regime and the Sackett decision. The agencies, in response to questioning from my staff, could not really tell us how this will be implemented or even if or when guidance would come for those states so that people know the rules of the road. For 23 states, and I believe that's your state, yes, your state, Mr. Chairman, and Washington, D.C., where the 2023 rule has not been enjoined, the agencies will implement their revised rule. A patchwork of states with differing definitions of federal jurisdiction is a regulatory nightmare for stakeholders, and you brought out a good point in your statement. A lot of these waters cross over from different state to state who now have different regimes. As it stands, without regulatory guidance from the agencies, no one has clarity on what either side of the bifurcated implementation scheme will mean for a given project in a given state. It's no wonder that everyone who wants to build something in this country, whether it's a road, a renewable energy project, a semiconductor facility, or a pipeline, everybody wants permitting reform. It's essential for policymakers and regulatory agencies to actually address these issues and ensure transparent and inclusive decision-making when formulating these environmental regulations. Although through a fair and transparent approach, only through that fair and transparent approach, can we develop effective policies that protect our natural resources, our precious air and water, and have sustainable growth. The Supreme Court correctly applied the Clean Water Act in the Sackett case. Had the administration faithfully followed the court's decision, then perhaps we would have avoided this ongoing litigation and the patchwork regulatory standard that we see now exists. Instead, it's likely going to be up to the courts again to constrain administrative overreach or to give us some clarity. Despite this summer's rulemaking, Sackett was a significant step forward in an effort to make permitting more efficient and in an effort to limit federal agency authority to the parameters set by this Congress or our Congress. Cooperative federalism enshrined in statute, when correctly applied, will protect our environment and our economy, and the executive branch should follow these instructions from both Congress and the judiciary to move in that direction. So I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much for that opening statement. And now we're going to hear from our three witnesses, two in person and one joining us remotely. First, Dr. Masheka. How's that? Masheka. All right. Sullivan. You don't make it easy for us. Who is a professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation and the director of the, is it Baruch? Institute for Coastal Ecology and Forest Science at Clemson University, the home of the Tigers. Dr. Sullivan received a bachelor's degree in anthropology and Native American studies from Dartmouth College and earned his master's degree in biology and PhD in natural resources from the University of Vermont. After earning his PhD, Dr. Sullivan was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Idaho, and he also served as faculty in the School of Environmental and Natural Resources at, I'd never say the Ohio State, I'll say at Ohio State from 2008 to 2022. I mentioned earlier the Cuyahoga River catching on fire the year after I'd gone into the Navy in 1969. That was long after you, long before you showed up on campus there to be part of the faculty. But Dr. Sullivan has authored something like 81 peer-reviewed publications on aquatic ecosystems and water body connectivity. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That's a lot. Next, I thought maybe that was a typo, but all right. Next, we're going to hear from Courtney Revels. I just love that name. He had a great name, Revels. And who is the water justice organizer for Bayou City Water Keeper in Texas. Ms. Revels is a community organizer and education justice advocate who works tirelessly for equity in underserved communities. She has advocated for infrastructural improvements to drainage systems, equitable distribution of resources, and disaster preparedness in Northeast Houston. Last but not least, we're going to hear from Susan Bodine, who is a partner at Earth and Water Law. We have somebody came up with a term called Carper Town. People who work with me in the Navy, your treasurer, congressman, governor, senator, whatever, and we consider you part of EPW town. And so great to have you back, and thank you for joining us. We don't always agree on everything, but we respect you hugely, as you know, and welcome you warmly back to this hearing room. But prior to enjoying E&W Law, Ms. Bodine served as the Assistant Administrator for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance from 2017 to 2021. From 2006 to 2009, you served as Assistant Administrator for the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response, which is now called the Office of Land and Emergency Management. Ms. Bodine also served as a Chief Counsel for this committee from 2015 to 2017. She's a graduate of Princeton University and the University of Pennsylvania's School of Law. I think, I don't know if Albert Einstein ever taught. I think he was a professor at either Dartmouth or Princeton. But I like to quote him like every day: in adversity lies opportunity. And that's when we look, there's some adversity here before us today, but I think there's some opportunity as well. So a shout out to him. Welcome and thank you to each of you for your willingness to testify before our committee today. And we're now pleased to hear the testimony of all three of you, starting with Dr. Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Please proceed.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to...
It's Capito.
Capito.
Yeah, it's Sullivan.
I was going to say.
We're going to get it. We're going to have to get these. We're going to get these stresses right. Nonetheless, thank you for the opportunity to stand before you today and discuss the implications of this case for our nation. As Senator Carper has said, I've authored 81 peer-reviewed publications on aquatic ecosystems and water body connectivity, so I spent a lot of my career focused on these questions. In my capacity as a member of the American Fisheries Society and the Society for Freshwater Science, I contributed to an amicus brief to the U.S. Supreme Court in the Sackett versus Environmental Protection Agency. I have included the brief as well as some key publications in my written testimony. As described by Justice Alito, Sackett concerns a nagging question about the outer reaches of the Clean Water Act, the principal federal law regulating water pollution in the United States. These outer reaches, as he terms them, in fact, refer to our nation's most vulnerable waters. Sackett disregards the established science around these smaller and often non-perennial streams and wetlands, which shows that they maintain hydrological, chemical, and biological functions that are essential in sustaining human well-being, ecological health, and the economy. For example, they are critically important for fisheries, flood control, drought mitigation, carbon storage, and biodiversity, including many endangered species, as well as recreationally and commercially valuable fishes like salmon and herring. We have a few slides here. I'm not sure if they're going to pop up. You got it. Yes, we'll be on the second one. I don't know where they are. Yeah, so the decision is catastrophic for water protection across the United States. The U.S. Supreme Court declared that a wetland must have a continuous surface connection with the water of the United States to be afforded federal Clean Water Act protection. By requiring adjoinment, Sackett sets a far more limited standard for jurisdiction than any prior agency rule. Please refer to the figure in the slide, which shows how the conforming rule strips protections from our nation's waters. This ruling removes the majority of U.S. wetlands from federal protection. For example, nationwide, approximately 16.3 million acres of wetlands, or roughly the size of West Virginia, are non-floodplain wetlands, meaning they're found outside of, non-adjacent to streams or rivers, such as prairie potholes, and will not be federally protected. Next slide. We must recognize that this historic loss of protections is occurring at a time when the United States has already lost vast amounts of wetlands. 22 states have experienced a loss of wetland area greater than 50%. Many Midwestern states have lost greater than 80%. Likewise, 5 million acres of wetlands existed at the time of California's statehood in 1850. Today, only 9% of those wetlands remain. While the court's opinion is focused on wetlands, it also jeopardizes headwater streams. Non-permanent ephemeral and intermittent streams represent 59% of all streams in the conterminous United States, and greater than 81% of streams in the arid and semi-arid Southwest. Across the nation, at least 4.8 million miles of streams are ephemeral and are left without protection. Next slide. Conservative estimates suggest that wetlands outside of floodplains, such as prairie potholes, provide $673 billion per year, whereas headwater streams, small streams at the upper ends of watersheds, contribute $15.7 trillion per year to the U.S. economy via the ecosystem services listed on the slide. And if you can't see them, we're talking about water purification, recreation, climate regulation, and others. Loss of protections for these waters creates a direct risk to human life and well-being from flooding and drought, with marginalized communities most at risk. Wetlands are key players in reducing the number and severity of floods. On the flip side, wetlands protect against drought by storing water during times of high flows and releasing it slowly over time, returning it to the water table during times of scarcity. Next slide. Sackett's inadequate protection of water resources on tribal lands leaves vast swaths of reservation streams and wetlands unprotected, and does not uphold the U.S. trust responsibility to the tribes. Hunting, gathering, and fishing from wetlands and headwater streams, for example, are critical for subsistence-based economies of rural Alaskan Native peoples. In this slide, you can see that ephemeral streams represent 90, 39, and 73% of reservation stream length on the Fort Apache Reservation in New Mexico and Arizona, Coeur d'Alene Reservation in Idaho, and Menominee Reservation in Wisconsin, respectively. The court describes non-navigable wetlands and streams as outer reaches, but this is akin to minimizing the importance of the network of capillaries and small veins to the functioning of our circulatory systems and overall condition. The court's decision has significantly weakened water protection and gambled with environmental, human, and economic health at a time when protections should be strengthened. Climate change will only exacerbate this situation. In closing, I remember meeting Wilma Mankiller when she was the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. She said that in Iroquois society, leaders are encouraged to remember 7 generations in the past and consider 7 generations in the future when making decisions that affect the people. Not only do I stand before you today as a scientist, but also as a father of 4 and a citizen. Water is a precious and finite resource. The information I've provided you today is based on science. It's not hyperbole. I urge you to value the science, consider the 7 generations to come, and remedy the situation. Thank you.
Dr. Sullivan, thank you very much for your testimony. We're going to ask Ms. Rebels to join us remotely. And Ms. Rebels, you're recognized for 5 minutes. And once you conclude your testimonies, we'll come back to Susan Bodine. All right. Ms. Rebels, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito, for hosting this hearing to examine the implications of Sackett versus the EPA for Clean Water Act's protections of wetlands and streams. My name is Courtney Rebels, Water Justice Organizer for Bayou City Waterkeeper and a lifelong resident of Houston, Texas. Bayou City Waterkeeper is a Houston-based organization that serves the lower Galveston Bay watershed with a focus on improving water quality, wetlands protection, and flood mitigation across our region while emphasizing climate resilience and environmental justice. I am also a member of the Northeast Action Collective, which organizes for drainage equity in Northeast Houston. My role within Bayou City Waterkeeper is to organize community members and shed light on experiences in communities most vulnerable to impacts on water pollution, systems failures, underinvestment, and wetland development. Water justice is a personal issue for me because in my community in Northeast Houston, I've experienced reoccurring flooding in the ditches near my home and my daughter's school. We are the communities on the front lines of climate-related changes and flooding. I am determined to fight for my community and the safety of my daughter. My journey in advocacy has been deeply rooted in the quest for flood mitigation, infrastructure enhancement, increasing community engagement, and bolstering community resilience. Houston is emblematic of the struggle against climate change-induced storm flooding. I have witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of these issues. The greater Houston region has repeatedly experienced floods and storm surges, including 2017's Hurricane Harvey that caused over 100 deaths and over $125 billion in damage. In Houston, our watershed is home to some of the most unique and diverse wetlands in the world. These wetlands and others provide real services to our communities that often go unnoticed, like reduced costs to water treatment plants for purifying and filtering our drinking water, as well as soaking in and storing flood waters during heavy rainstorms. With climate change heightening the pressure on our infrastructure, the functions provided by healthy natural water systems are even more critical. Many of the wetlands in our region do not directly border or have continued service connections to another jurisdictional water, so they no longer qualify as waters of the United States or the Clean Air the Clean Water Act's protections, yet they have real connections to the way our ecosystems function, and refusing to protect them has consequences to our environment and communities. The impact of less protective federal regulations will likely hit frontline communities like mine the hardest. When we pave over wetlands, floodwaters that would normally be stored in soils flow quickly to communities downstream. This strains our infrastructure and exacerbates flooding that disproportionately impacts Black and lower income neighborhoods. The water is often polluted not only from industrial waste, but also from sewer overflows during rain events, spewing untreated sewage into our neighborhoods, homes, and waterways. This decision also emphasizes the need for local and regional policy solutions and investments that can preserve large ecosystems as a mean for flood and climate protection. As our region grapples with how to address the intense storms, rising sea levels, it becomes more important to protect our remaining wetlands at highest risk of loss due to development and other reasons. Aging systems ill-equipped to cope with the surge in demand and impact on extreme weather events puts immense strain on our communities, and these burdens disproportionately fall on marginalized communities who lack the resources and political representation to address these issues. Today, I lift up the urgency of protecting wetlands not just as an issue of water conservation or water protection, but also as flood equity and ultimately as environmental justice. Together with local organizations and communities, I'm committed to working towards addressing these water justice crises, fostering resilience, and championing equity. Our collective efforts are integral to forging a more sustainable and just future where no one is left behind in the face of water-related challenges. We need even more everyone locally in the states and here in DC to understand that when we lose Clean Water Act protections, we are facing a water justice crisis. Thank you guys for the opportunity to testify today.
All right, we guys are happy.
I mean, you senators, I'm so sorry. Thank you.
We're just regular guys and gals. But welcome, thanks for that testimony, especially for your clothes. And now we're going to recognize not a stranger in this room, but someone that we've worked with and admired for a long time, though we don't always agree, but we have great respect for her, and Susan Bodine. Susan, you're recognized, if you will, for 5 minutes. Please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee for inviting me to testify today on the Sackett decision. I don't disagree that all water is connected. My children learned about the water cycle in the 4th grade. But the committee needs to understand that the connectivity report that Dr. Sullivan talked about and worked on was written to support the notion that significant nexus, these connections create a significant nexus to a navigable water. It's important to recognize that all 9 Supreme Court justices held that significant nexus is not a valid basis for establishing Clean Water Act jurisdiction. Further, the background of the 1972 amendments to the Clean Water Act make it clear that the relatively permanent waters test that was articulated in Rapanos, picked up in Sackett, is consistent with the text and legislative history of the Act. As I discussed in my written testimony and in the article attached to that testimony, Senator Muskie's staff, and yes, you recognize Senator Carper that he was one of the lead authors, they've talked about what they were trying to do in 72. And he said, at the time of the negotiations, the House and Senate staff believed that the scope of federal jurisdiction that they authorized in the 1972 amendments were more constrained than the scope identified by the Supreme Court in both the Swank decision on isolated waters and the Rapanos decision. So the Sackett case hasn't removed any Clean Water Act jurisdiction. It reaffirmed its original scope. Despite Sackett, as I discussed in my written testimony, I'm actually concerned about how the opinion will be implemented. In particular, I'm worried about the position that has taken in the preamble to the January 2023 rule that a continuous surface connection makes a wetland adjacent, and that it's just a physical connection, not a water connection, just a physical connection. Well, all features on the landscape are connected, just like all water is connected. And so under this interpretation, you could argue that all wetlands are connected, and that therefore all wetlands are considered adjacent. I'm also worried about the test for relatively permanent waters that's articulated not in the regs, but in the preamble in January 23. Again, that you can say something is relatively permanent just if you see a bed and bank, just if you see like wet leaves. That's the same test that had been used in the past to identify a stream, even a stream or a channel that only has water when it rains. So again, the way they've interpreted Sackett is to retain and perhaps go back to the same issues that gave rise to these Supreme Court cases. I also disagree that Sackett means we've lost a lot of authority. So, for example, referring to Ms. Revel's testimony, I worked on Corps of Engineers projects for Houston. When I was in the committee and in the House, I worked on the combined sewer overflow and sanitary sewer overflow, the sewer overflow consent decree for the city of Houston when I was at EPA. Neither of those authorities are affected at all by Sackett. Both of those authorities can actually incorporate wetlands into their projects to achieve their goals. Again, and waterways are still protected based on the authority under point source. So if you have a ditch, if you have a channel, even if it's a ephemeral channel, that can be a point source. And you can't dump pollutants into that channel. The channel itself isn't a water of the United States, but it's a point source that, if it leads to a water of the United States, results in a discharge into a water of the United States, it's still regulated. You still need a permit. And even if wetlands don't directly abut, although, leaving aside the fact that, it's a the agencies think it's a physical connection only, but even if you don't directly abut, many wetlands are still going to be protected by other programs. Fish and Wildlife Service has grants under the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. The Department of Agriculture protects wetlands through its conservation programs. And there are a lot of non-federal partners, Ducks Unlimited, Nature Conservancy, many local watershed organizations, all work and cooperatively with the private sector, with landowners, to conserve wetlands. And states, too, have adopted their own definitions of waters of the state, and about 26 of them have their own separate state programs to protect those waters. The other 24 do rely on their 401 authority, which means that they can attach conditions to any kind of federal spending or project if there is a discharge to something that is a WOTUS. But the way that's been interpreted in a recent rule by the Biden administration, you can then attach conditions whether or not, if all you need is one discharge, and then you can attach kind of whatever conditions you want. So that authority is still there too. But I do also want to emphasize that back in '72, the staff was worried, and the senators were worried about federalism and constitutional limitations on their authority. So as you look at this issue, I just ask you to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you for testimony. In fact, thanks to all of you for your testimonies this morning. Before I have a couple of more prepared questions I'm going to ask, but I just want to start off and say, Dr. Sullivan, do you want to respond or comment on anything that Ms. Bodine has said, please?
Yeah, I do, and I appreciate the comments, and I think that a few points. One is, I think we need to ask the right questions, and I'm here as a scientist, and the intent of the Clean Water Act, I think we can all agree, is to provide clean water. And it is expansive by definition. It wasn't called the Clean Large Rivers Act or the Clean Large Lakes Act. I mean, by the name alone, I think the intent is clear in terms of its the understanding of protecting waters broadly. I think that's an important point as we think about what the science tells us around protecting clean water. The connectivity report that Ms. Bodine referred to, the intent of that was to provide an exhaustive and comprehensive understanding of the literature around how upstream and upslope waters can relate or affect downstream and downslope waters. It was not within the context explicit. In fact, we were directed to focus on the science and not the policy. Now, while it has implications for the significant nexus, it has equal implications for where we are today. So that information is incredibly valuable. What we've seen since that time in the science, in the decade since that time, is increased evidence that changes, alterations of upstream and upslope waters have significant effects on downstream and downslope waters. So I think that report is meant to buttress the science and really show those important connectivity, how physical, chemical, biological connectivity is critical in maintaining clean drinking water, for example, for downstream waters. So I think those are really important points. In terms of the programs, and perhaps we'll talk about that later, I think a lot of the programs that Ms. Bodine mentioned, I agree, those are excellent programs, but they are not a comprehensive national legislation that sets the bar for protection. Many of those are actually programs that are restoring, not conserving. And we know from decades of research that restoration, although very important, does not equal conservation. And I think we all know that from our own bodies. I injured my wrist a few years ago, had to have surgery. It works, right? It's restored, but it's not the same as the original condition. So a lot of those programs are actually are towards restoring. They're also patchy in their distribution. For example, the Clean Water Act is based on individual organisms and their life history strategies. So species that have very small ranges, right? That's where that's limited to. It's not a comprehensive national program or legislation, and I think that's what we need to protect the science.
All right, thanks very much for that. Let me yield to Senator Capito.
Thank you. Thank you both, or all three of you, for being here. So the Biden administration has come in and revised the rule as a reaction to the Sackett opinion. And the Supreme Court found unanimously that, for different reasons, that the mere presence of water does not allow for federal jurisdictions. So they have removed the phrase significant nexus from the rule and kind of called it a day. So, Ms. Bodine, would you describe the jurisprudence here? And am I right that mere deletions cannot satisfy the requirements that were laid out by our Supreme Court?
Thank you, Senator Capito. I'm concerned because, and I agree with you, and the reason is that when the Biden administration wrote their rule in January, knowing full well that the Sackett decision was pending, they hedged their bets, and so they wrote both on significant nexus and relatively permanent waters, but they didn't put the definitions of what they meant, going to Senator Carper's clarity point, they did not put it in rule language. They, I think, attempted to isolate it from judicial review by putting all of that in preamble language. So when they issued their conforming rule on September 7th, they excised significant nexus out of the rule language, but they left in all of their preamble language about what is that related to the Rapanos test. What is a relatively permanent connection? What does it mean to be relatively permanent? What is a continuous surface connection? All that's still there. And they affirmed in a memo that they wrote on September 27th that that is controlling. So that January 23 language from the preamble is controlling the jurisdictional determinations in the field.
So I would say simplify there. What I'm hearing is that we're going to be back at court, and this is going to be back up to the Supreme Court the way the administration has rewritten this rule. Would that be a safe statement?
Yes, I agree with you.
Okay. Let me ask you this. I talked about the rulemaking process, and they kind of skirted a little bit the rules there in terms of public input, which is kind of ironic because in this committee, all we hear about is community input and how we need to make sure we're listening to community, which I believe is extremely valuable, and we should be doing that, and that's a big emphasis. but they didn't go through this. How is that going to hold up as we move forward legally here?
I was very surprised they took that approach. There is an exemption in the Administrative Procedure Act saying that if comment is unnecessary, then you don't need to go through notice and comment. But the only time comment is unnecessary is if Congress took away all the discretion from the agencies. If there's any discretion, then you have to take notice and comment. And there certainly is, there are certainly questions that remain open based on the Sackett decision. In fact, there's a whole discussion about interstate waters in the Sackett decision that they didn't address at all. And then, of course, there's this whole issue of how they're going to implement it, which is in the preamble language.
Well, I think, too, also to get to it, and I think, we have, as much as we might have a different approach to what we're trying to get here, one of the conforming themes, I think, that the chairman and I have, and all of us have, is some kind of consistency. So if we look at this map, we've got the purple and the green. The purple is conforming to the 2015 rule. The green is to the new rule. I mean, how in the world are farmers or construction, anything, going to go forward trying to figure this maze of regulatory mishmash? To me, that is makes it even more difficult than it already is.
I agree with you completely, and the reason is that the way they wrote the rule, again, not by creating definitions that could be challenged in court, but by essentially leaving everything to a case-by-case determination. And so those case-by-case determinations about how they're going to implement stuff on the ground, that is going to lead to inconsistency, and we have seen that before. There's a really interesting 2004 GAO report on how different core districts around the country took completely different interpretations, and we're going to be back to that.
And then just to simplify it in regular terms, the whole Sackett case was about a couple trying to build a house near a lake. I mean, so it is very granular. We're talking kind of big, bold definitions and how it's going to implement and everything. But basically, it's about homeowners, construction folks, farmers. It's the basic parts of our different states that are most deeply affected. So I think I'm out of time, and I'll turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks for those questions. Next, Senator Kramer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Senator Capito, and to all of our witnesses. I do think you're right. We are sort of arguing two things here. You're arguing the science and the effects. You're arguing the law and the Constitution. For those of us that want to go back and forward 7 generations, my 6th great-grandfather gave his life at Bunker Hill for the cause of liberty. And I believe if we're going to use broad definitions, that would be for the cause of federalism, not an insignificant issue that we should ignore for the science. But I want to ask you, Ms. Bodine, because earlier this year in this committee, Lieutenant General Spellman, the head of the Corps of Engineers, testified. I gasped when he said it. He said it rather casually in the context of workforce. He said that the Corps of Engineers has considers about 80 federal issues a year, decisions, 80,000 federal decisions per year. Do you believe that if there's 80,000 regulatory actions by the Corps of Engineers, that the clarification, the simplification of Sackett should reduce that workload for the Corps of Engineers, and perhaps there's some efficiency that we could actually gain from this?
Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see that, because the way they set it up, it is going to be case-by-case determinations instead of bright definitions.
Thank you. And that's my concern. It's like, how much simpler could they make it? And how much more prescriptive could they have been? And I suppose you could say we could be more prescriptive if we changed the Clean Water Act to the Navigable Waters Act, but we don't call the Endangered Species Act the Every Species Act. Titles are one thing, definitions another thing. I want to ask you about permitting reform. Senator Capito referenced the importance of it. A lot of us on all sides of the issue are concerned about and want some permitting reform. And one of the things that I've emphasized throughout this debate is it's become just as difficult to permit a wind farm or a solar farm, panel farm, or a transmission line as it is a fuels pipeline of some sort. And transmission lines and pipelines, and for that matter, interstate highways, are long, linear right? Long, linear, often, almost always, multi-state, multi-jurisdictional infrastructure. And because of the complexity of this type of infrastructure, Congress established the nationwide permit program to allow these projects to obtain one permit as long as they're determined to have a minimal effect on the environment. Can you discuss the importance of a nationwide permit and maybe also considering both the efficiency of it as well as the effectiveness, I guess, of a nationwide permit?
Yeah, the Corps of Engineers nationwide permits is really the reason why we haven't completely stopped building infrastructure in this country, because it is a more efficient and truncated review based on minimal impacts. There has been a gradual narrowing of the nationwide permits, which means that more and more would be subject to the individual permits, which are what take years and years and years and subject of lawsuits. If there isn't federal jurisdiction, then you don't need to get the nationwide permit. But that question is going to be decided case by case, and it remains to be seen how that'll be applied.
It's hard for me as a former regulator to imagine a multi-state, multi-jurisdictional linear infrastructure that doesn't have a federal nexus somewhere along the line, right? I mean, so it seemed to me that, anyway, that said, I think it's another part of the discussion I think we ought to get back to. Let me ask, where do you see the legal fight coming? I mean, obviously, if 2.5 pages of amendments to a 141-page rule in the context of a major Supreme Court decision isn't going to be adequate. Certainly not adequate for the Prairie Pothole region that I come from. And by the way, with all due respect, not federally protected does not mean not protected. In fact, I would submit that the mediocrity of the federal government is far, far worse for the protection of wetlands in North Dakota than what North Dakotans, and for that matter, what farmers, how they protect their own wetlands. But where do you see the legal fight coming in the next several months?
Well, I think, and again, I'm not representing anybody in this.
I understand.
But what I have read and heard is that, yes, there are groups that are going to challenge the September conforming rule based on both the issue of no notice and comment as well as the substance. And then the litigation over the January rule is ongoing. I said that's why it's not in effect. That's why it stayed in 26 states, and that litigation will go on. So yes, there'll still be litigation.
Well, let's face it. I mean, as long as there's chaos and uncertainty, there's going to be litigation and stays, and maybe that's a strategy in and of itself. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We've been joined by Senator Markley, and if you'd like to jump in, you're next in line. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
And after you, if nobody else shows up, Senator Mullen, you'd be next, and then Senator Bozeman.
So, Dr. Sullivan, it's well established the connection between wetlands and the nesting and feeding habits of 50% of North American birds, 31% of plant species. They just play a vital role in so many ways. I wanted to ask you, though, about a particular angle, and that is related to whether the loss of protection for wetlands impacts tribal communities. The wetlands are critical to sustain fish species, like the various protected species in Klamath Basin in Oregon, culturally significant plants and first foods. Are some of these vital ecological and culture functions in jeopardy? And how will Sackett affect tribes across the country?
Thank you, Senator Merkley. Yeah, so this is a critical issue, one which I work with many tribal partners myself, addressing these sorts of questions. So I think we probably need to back up a step to fully understand the situation. One is, the key piece is that for the dispossession of land, we entered into the trust responsibility with the tribes, and part of that trust responsibility was to protect natural resources, including water. And that's a really critical piece, that we have a burden of responsibility to protect water as well as other natural resources. The other piece of this is, and it's clear to understand that we have a duty to protect tribal rights and resources that we don't shoulder with every other group. And although this was initially meant to serve as a protectorate role, that trust responsibility has morphed today into federal authority that is considered plenary. And the reason that's important is the combination of limited tribal authority and plenary federal authority has caused tribes to rely heavily on federal environmental legislation rather than their inherent sovereignty for environmental protections within tribal lands. So that's one point I want to make. The other is that despite the trust responsibility, many tribes have found that federal protection of waters is insufficient, has been inadequate in providing sufficient protection, leading to impaired water quality, largely because of the TAS provisions, which is treatment as a state. And I want to make a point here. As of 2018, only 54 of the roughly 330 federally recognized tribes that meet TAS eligibility requirements had received TAS status, and only 44 of those had their water quality standards approved by the EPA. So this leads us to a situation where tribes are in limbo a little bit in terms of protecting water. To your point, these waters are critical. And I showed a map earlier of ephemeral streams across multiple reservations. Those were mapping that we did using the most advanced techniques to map ephemeral streams. Ephemeral streams and wetlands are critical for many tribal nations for a suite of different purposes, ranging from subsistence purposes, hunting, fishing, and gathering, to spiritual purposes. A couple specific examples I could give is camas is a critical plant in the western United States and in the Northwest. Where does it grow? It grows in areas around ephemeral streams. It grows in seasonal wetlands. These have been long-standing subsistence plants that are central to many tribal cultures, cultural practices, and subsistence. So that's an example where those waters then lose protection. Another point that I really want to make, and this is critical, is on many reservations due to the Allotment Act, the Dawes Act, which was essentially that even within reservation land, non-Indians were allowed to come in and purchase land. So the patchwork of jurisdiction on the reservations makes it very hard for the tribes to do this themselves, and they need the Clean Water Act protections to protect those critical systems. So I think it's a critically important piece. I'm actually working right now with the Coeur d'Alene tribe where we're looking at wetlands and restoring wetlands to actually combat drought on the reservation. So critical question, absolute need for a consistent protection at the federal level for wetlands, ephemeral streams, to protect multiple uses, beneficial uses for tribes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And my time's up, so I'll just close with a comment, which is in Oregon we've experienced intense droughts over the last few years, and so there's a lot more attention to the role of groundwater. Many ranchers starting to ask for oversight of the control of groundwater for that reason, because if the level drops too low, you're in trouble. But it's also drawn attention to the connection of the groundwater filtering and effect on cooling in terms of algae in the lakes and other factors, whether or not it's connected by surface water. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks. I know you've got a lot on your table this morning. Thanks so much for making time to join us and for your questions. Senator Mullen, you next, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is it Sullivan? Is that right? Where do you live? Where do you live?
South Carolina.
And city?
It's a small village called McClellanville.
And so how much time have you spent in Indian country?
How much time do I spend doing what?
How much time do you spend in Indian country?
Quite a bit. I used to live in Idaho. I have projects. I was just out actually.
Are you tribal yourself?
I'm not tribal, no.
You're not? I'm Cherokee. I lived in tribal land my whole life, and I can tell you, when you start talking about 7 generations, my kids are probably close to that. We live in Cherokee Nation, inside the reservation, my whole life, right? You bring up Wilma Mankiller and talk about 7 generations there, and you really, bring up a lot of interesting points, but you forget one thing, that tribes have been fighting forever to get the government out of the way. We don't need more government involvement. In fact, that's what led us to Oklahoma to begin with. And we've been fighting for water rights forever. And I can assure you, your definition is saying that all waters belong to the United States of America. Is that what you're saying? I mean, because that map you showed up said that everything flows eventually into what you consider a navigable body of water, and it's all connected. And so by your definition, you're saying that all waters belong to the waters of the U.S., right?
I'm going to back up a step there. Firstly, all the
No,
work.
I don't need you to back up. I'm just asking you, is that what your definition is?
Well, my definition is that waters of the U.S.
It's all tied together. That's basically what you're saying?
From a scientific perspective, waters
I'm
are
asking
tied
for-
together.
Okay, so,
I'm not.
so all waters belong to the U.S., so there is no private water rights. So all this land rights that we've been fighting for, farmers have been fighting for, tribals have been fighting for, actually it doesn't exist because underneath your definition, it all belongs to the United States. And we should all ask permission to the United States before we can even water our cows in a pond.
Yeah, no, not at all. And I think you're misinterpreting not
No,
only what I'm saying, but the
underneath your
intent of
broad
what I'm saying.
definition, underneath your broad definition, you're saying all waters belong to the waters of the U.S.
No, I'm not here. I am here as a scientist saying waters are connected.
Well, you're also giving your opinion too.
No,
Well, when you start talking about women, man killer, and you're saying you're talking about 7 generations, and you're doing all this, yes, you are. You're giving your opinion about this in a place that you haven't lived. And I take a little bit of offense to it to some degree because you keep talking about all this tribal like you're trying to protect tribal land, and you forget the simple fact that we have simply been fighting for water rights forever on our traditional lands, and we really don't want the federal government getting involved in it. That's not what we want. We want to be able to use our water without having to ask permission. And if you connect all the waters of the U.S. and you put underneath a broad definition of saying that everything's tied into that, then that's exactly what it would lead to. It would exactly, if you say all of it belongs underneath the waters of the U.S., everything we would do on tribal land from then on would be us required to have some type of permit from a big overreaching federal government. Would that be fair to say?
I'm waiting for you to finish so I can respond.
Go ahead.
So I think I have a couple points to make. First of all, I absolutely respect where you're coming from. I have the work I'm presenting today, and it's part of my written testimony, is with tribal partners who wrote these papers and we're working together. So these are not just, you're talking about opinions, but these are points that we are deriving together in collaboration. And the position I have here is, as a scientist, understanding how these waters are connected and how alterations of that connectivity can impact waters on tribal lands.
But
with
you're
my
saying they're
tribal
all
colleagues.
connected.
They're connected.
Are you not afraid of the overreach of the federal government at this point? Because I am very skeptical.
That is beyond, my role here is as a scientist. I'm not talking.
Underneath the Clean Water Act, we originally said that it was navigable bodies of water. Navigable bodies of water. The reason why we said the original navigable bodies of water when we started talking about the 404 and the 402 permits was because we wanted to limit the scope and the reach of the federal government. We came in and redefined that to the waters of the U.S., and that specifically said the adjacent because we were afraid of the federal government overreach, of going too far in country. Now we're saying that everything is tied into. There's 72,000 farmers in Oklahoma, 72,000. I'm one of them. My family have been raising cattle on the same land we've been to since we were forced to walk there in the mid-1830s. And it is very difficult to say that now, from now on, are you gaveling me down and everybody else has went farther than me?
No, I did not go like that, okay? I went.
The gentleman before
Just to,
me
no,
spoke
just to
for
remind,
a
excuse me, just to remind you that your time has expired. Continue, okay?
I'm good.
All right. Please, go ahead. Thank you.
Welcome, witnesses. Ms. Bodine, are you concerned that the wording of the 2023 rule will create uncertainty for landowners across the West, and particularly in Wyoming?
Yes, Senator Lummis, I am very concerned about that. It has been set up as case-by-case jurisdiction, and as what we've seen before, that has led to regulatory expansion and inconsistencies.
During your time at the EPA, have you ever seen the administration willfully ignore the court's ruling as they seem to be doing in Sackett?
I have not.
What are they hanging their coat on in terms of departing from what seemed to be clear direction in Sackett to get to where they are today?
In their September 7th or 8th conforming rule, they excise significant nexus out of their regulations. And that is accurate, that reflects what the Sackett decision said. But what they left was all of the interpretive language, which was in guidance in preamble. They didn't put it in regs, and that makes it all case by case, but they left it all intact, and they've said, this is what we're going to do on a case-by-case basis to follow it. And if you compare what they say, how they're going to interpret these terms with the opinion, they don't match. But we may end up having to people may end up having to litigate that on a permit-by-permit basis and not by challenging the rule. That remains to be seen.
It seems so unique to me that this could be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, especially after a decision like Sackett. What makes that possible?
They could have written bright lines in their conforming rule and chose not to. I do think that the agencies are trying to hold on to as much jurisdiction as they had, that they wanted. There has to be some case by case. I'm not going to say that everything is absolutely bright line, but what we have here is essentially 100% case by case.
Yeah, I'm deeply concerned about that because some of the examples pre-Sackett of enforcement actions in Wyoming would, to the just naked eye of people with common sense, seem to be beyond the scope of the federal government. It also seems to fail to recognize state jurisdiction over water, especially quantity, but also quality. So what would you advise if you were involved in the decision-making at the agency as a clarification, so we're not just in this pattern of litigating? It almost seems like an effort is being made to run out the clock on people who are regulated and then have to access the courts to have a more reasonable interpretation of the law.
Yes, most people just want to get their project done, and so they won't litigate. And that is how you get kind of ever-increasing claims of jurisdiction. You talked about some examples that were, older examples of overreach. My concern is that the way they've set this rule up, they've left the door open to go back to that same overreach because of the way they're defining their terms. I would recommend that the operative terms of how the statute should be implemented should be in rule language and not just left to a guidance document.
We're told frequently that guidance is not necessarily something that has to be adhered to with a bright red line, but then there are examples where it is.
Correct.
Does the Congress need to step in and define guidance in a way that makes it less onerous?
If the agencies take the position that a guidance is binding, it's a rule.
Yeah.
And it can be challenged in court.
I thank the witness. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, ma'am. We've been joined by Senator Markey. Senator Markey, welcome. And you're recognized. Before you do that, let me ask for a unanimous consent request, if I could, to submit for the record an amicus brief submitted in the Sackett case by 18 federally recognized tribes outlining their concerns with the narrowing Clean Water Act protections. This brief affirms that narrowing Clean Water Act protections through Sackett would have dire consequences for tribes, including by undercutting their ability to protect against cross-border pollution. Is there objection? Hearing none. Senator Markey. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. This year alone, we've seen severe flooding, costly storms across the country. We know that climate change is only going to make those disasters worse, more water, more often, and wetlands are vital to storing water before it gets into our homes and our communities. Almost 2/3 of our wetlands are now at risk of development and destruction thanks to this misguided Supreme Court ruling. Dr. Sullivan, do you agree that the Sackett ruling is likely to intensify damage from flooding at a time when we actually need greater storage capacity from our wetlands thanks to climate supercharged storms?
Thank you, Senator Markey. I do. I absolutely agree. I think one of the key pieces that we have to recognize there is we've lost tremendous capacity already. So we're past a 50% loss of wetlands in the United States. I mentioned that earlier. Some of these states are upwards of 90%. So we're already at a point where the capacity of wetlands to mitigate flooding, exactly through the way you described, wetlands act as sponges, right? So during times of higher flows, they store water and they release that slowly. They release it not only back onto the landscape, but into groundwater. And wetlands in their historic distribution, you would have seen them hemming most rivers and serving that role. And so I think as we are at a point now where we're working with a limited set, it's like, on a commercial 2-engine airliner, we're down to 1 engine right now. And so when we think about how we are going to maximize the benefits of wetlands, one of those is understanding maximizing their protection so that we maintain the capacity for wetlands to mitigate against floods, which costs money and costs lives, but also on the flip side, as we discussed earlier, to maximize their capacity to mitigate drought. Those are flip sides of the same coin.
So is it true that building over wetlands will also contribute to heat surges, amplifying the urban heat island effect that we had a hearing on recently?
That is absolutely true. I think, and it's not just wetlands, it's streams. In fact, there's a well-known scientific principle called the urban stream syndrome, which discusses the changes streams go through under urbanization. And streams and wetlands in urban environments create microclimates and reduce heat. They absorb, they provide green spaces, and they do exactly that. They create favorable climatic conditions at the local scale. Okay. So very critical functions.
And from the Sackett ruling, we are supposed to think that the upstream headwaters don't have any relation to the downstream bodies of water that we fish in, swim in, and enjoy, but we know that water rolls downhill, so any problems in that water will roll down with it. Ms. Ravels, from what you've seen as a waterkeeper, is it possible to protect our larger rivers, lakes, and bays without protecting headwater streams and wetlands?
Absolutely not. In my experience, with just different things within communities, like as a community member, I see on the grassroots level all of the things that are affecting our waterway, like industry, stormwater runoff, things that we don't talk about that lead into our waterway that has to go somewhere. We know that water goes somewhere, and in these disasters where water's sitting and flowing, everything is moving everywhere. It's a necessity to keep these protections so that our wetlands can work the way wetlands work, by filtering and purifying and putting less pressure on our infrastructure within our cities.
Okay, and so do protected wetlands help keep stormwater from flooding chronically underinvested communities with aging or limited infrastructure? Mr. Rebels.
Absolutely. Particularly communities like mine. Um, and particularly communities like mine, now we're seeing that the removal of over 126 acres of wetlands that was previously in front of my neighborhood. And we're just going to be able to like sit back and see what happens, but we already know it's going to happen. More flooding and more devastation.
And in your experience, do those heavy storms cause an uptick in pollution from industrial waste and untreated sewerage overflow into communities like yours?
Absolutely. Because these things are left, um, they haven't been addressed yet. So when left unaddressed, it absolutely impacts the bigger, more broader picture of how things are happening in the city. We, Ms. Bodine addressed the consent decree. We're still trying to make that work for the community, right? That we're still trying to see the impacts of those on the grassroots level. So yes, we need the protections to remain the way they are so that we can see more protections for our communities. Communities are the last persons that are asked questions. We've sat here, we talked about protected wetlands, we talked about birds, we talked about tribes, but like the frontline communities that are seeing the cancer clusters and the cancer plumes and how the water moves those things around are the last to be spoken about or spoken to.
Yep. Thank you so much. Thanks, all of you, for your testimony. Thank you, Mr.
So, Mark, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for those questions. Been joined by my neighbor from Pennsylvania, Senator Fetterman. Good to see you. Welcome. You're recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Chairman, hi, welcome. Thank you for coming today. Just kind of set the stage here. Pennsylvania. Dr. Sullivan, how do wetlands in Pennsylvania impact our drinking water?
Wetlands in Pennsylvania and everywhere are critical in purifying water. And they do actually have three really important pieces to that. They trap sediment, so they remove sediment out of the water. They remove nutrients, so nitrogen, phosphorus, those types of nutrients. And they detox the water, so they take chemicals out. In doing that, they reduce a huge expense to the taxpayer of purifying water. So they do that in Pennsylvania, absolutely. They do that across the country. And they do that in a way that is 24/7. They work full time.
So because of the wetland, you know, that is an impact on clean water, right?
Correct.
Gosh, I find clean water useful often. It's remarkable.
Well, I can say in all my years, I've never.
I think it's, you know, I support clean water. So we have the situation here. The Supreme Court believes that unlimited money is speech, and they believe that women's in this nation aren't entitled to reproductive freedom. And now they attack the Clean Water Act as well too. Again, the shocking opinion that clean water might be useful to Americans. Now, do you believe that this is now based on the politics, or is it because of a very careful, thorough, scientific kind of review?
Sackett got the science all wrong, and that's what I can say. The science is crystal clear. It's not confusing, right? The chemical, physical, biological integrity, which is the goal of the Clean Water Act, of downstream and downslope waters, is relies on wetlands and streams, and so it's virtually impossible to restore and maintain the health of waters and uphold the primary goal of the Clean Water Act while only protecting adjoining waters.
Yeah. Now, look, I'm no scientist. Our friends in Fox News don't even think I should be a senator. But to me, personally, it just seems like it's really kind of an extreme, right-wing kind of deregulation, obsessed that the Supreme Court, and I believe that it puts Pennsylvania's drink water at risk. Could you explain that to me as a non-scientist?
explain how it puts it at risk?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so removing wetlands, removing streams from the landscape, now I understand they're not protected, and people are saying that, well, just because they're not protected, there are other mechanisms potentially that are there, but history tells us a very different story. We arrived at a place where we had already lost 50% more of our wetlands across the country. It's only through legislation like the Clean Water Act that we actually
More than 50%, I want to read, more than 50% of our critical wetlands.
more than 50% of wetlands are lost, have been lost historically. That rate continued until the Clean Water Act, until legislation came that then started to slow down wetland loss. And so, unfortunately, history tells us there's no evidence to suggest that that's going to change unless we protect wetlands, set the standard for protection nationally and across the floor. So I think that's really critical. And I would say too that the U.S. public agrees. There's a poll in the New York Times that 72% of American adults believe the Clean Water Act should be read broadly to include wetlands and not only major streams, rivers, and lakes.
Yeah. I believe clean water is cool, and we need it. And I think that's kind of our job to make sure we want to protect that as well, too. And it's truly bizarre to me personally that anybody would attack the kind of legislation that has been a demonstrative kind of dramatic kind of change in our water quality, right? Is that accurate?
I know, it's absolutely accurate. And can I add one small piece there is that, I think as we think about these, and I brought this up earlier, are we asking the right questions? In my humble opinion, we should be aligning with the science first. And then once we have that set, then decide how do we use water responsibly within that context.
Oh, so wait, you're suggesting that we follow the science?
I am absolutely suggesting that we follow
Lunacy.
the science.
Lunacy.
Just like when we go to the physician, we want them to follow the best medicine
Okay,
for our
well,
health.
anyway, thank you for joining, and I apologize for going over, Chairman. Thank you.
Not at all. We're glad you're here. Thanks. Senator Capito.
Well, I think I'd like to ask one final question before I have to go to another event. The federal government does protect clean water. Our state governments protect clean water, and you mentioned other agencies that are involved in this as well. So, Ms. Bodine, could you kind of enumerate for me where the protections are? We are not eliminating or getting rid of any, protections of clean water here. We're actually asking an administration to heed the decision, in part a unanimous decision by our Supreme Court, and to adhere to the law as it was written 51 years ago, and then it has been amended to then. So could you just say, if somebody's listening to this, what are our water protections now and how they exist?
Thank you, Senator Capito. I know that the Sackett decision has been depicted as this radical change, and it really isn't. For example, when you talk about isolated waters and wetlands, which the connectivity report tried to establish a basis for regulating those, even though in 2001, Supreme Court said you couldn't regulate them under the Swank decision. Since that decision in 2001, however many years ago that was, EPA and the Corps have not tried to regulate these isolated wetlands and isolated waters because of Swank. They tried to expand their jurisdiction through interpretations, including relying on the connectivity report, but they haven't done that. So that's not even a change from practice because of other Supreme Court decisions. And so in terms, so that, again, that would be status quo. But in terms of protections, we have, I mean, we have other programs, including cooperative programs, that people engage in that protect wetlands. I mean, we do talk about the agriculture, the conservation programs from USDA. The Fish and Wildlife Service talked about how after Swank, after 2001, they said 88% of the prairie potholes are not regulated. Okay. But then they went on to say, look, we work with the farmers in a cooperative way, and in the wet years, they're not plowing the prairie potholes. In the dry years, they can plant there. And it's cyclical because of how climate works. It's always cyclical. So again, that's not the same as saying you can never plow there. It's not the same as taking someone's land away. And that, again, was the status quo that was described in a 2014 report by Fish and Wildlife Service. And then, of course, when we talked about waterways, yeah, it is true. Yeah, water flows downstream, undisputedly. You can't just dump pollutants into a channel, and I don't care whether it's ephemeral or a ditch or any kind of channel, a fissure. All those meet the definition of a point source in the Clean Water Act. You discharge into a point source, and it's conveyed, another word from the statute, to a navigable water. It's regulated. So a lot of regulatory remains, a lot of non-regulatory remains. When we talk about other authorities and other projects like the infrastructure projects that this committee spent a lot of time on, I have to disagree. Like the Corps of Engineers projects that I was talking about for flood control have nothing to do with restoration. The Restoration Authority is a different authority of the Corps. The flood control, they do, we call it soft infrastructure or green infrastructure. That's not a restoration. That's setting aside or buying up land instead of building levees. I mean, that's done. That is part of projects where you preserve it, you preserve the wetlands to avoid exactly the flood impacts that I think Ms. Revels was talking about. And we do the same thing with our sewer overflow projects. We call it green infrastructure. Senator Markey was talking about stormwater. I'm personally aware of a number of stormwater projects and consent decrees where the solution was setting aside land to act as the sponge. That was the solution to deal with the stormwater problem. So none of those authorities are affected at all by the Sackett decision.
Thank you both. All three of you, thank you.
All right. Senator Capito, thanks. We'll see you on the floor later today.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. I have a couple of questions. We may be joined by a few of our other colleagues, and we're going to start voting here. In fact, we may have already started voting, but let's keep going until we run out of time. Are you okay on time right now? All right. Yeah. Ms. Revels, are you okay on time? Hello, Ms. Revels?
I'm good. Yes, I'm good. Thank you.
All right, good. Ms. Revels, we've just been joined by Senator Whitehouse while he settles in. Tell us, where are you today? Are you in Houston?
Yes, I'm in Houston.
Okay. All right. We've just been joined by a senator from a state even smaller than Delaware. That would be the state of Rhode Island. And we're delighted that Sheldon Whitehouse has joined. He's a great member of this committee. And Sheldon, when you're ready, you're on.
Higher, but smaller. We share being coastal, we share being small, and we share being faced by having to redraw the maps of our states thanks to fossil fuel emissions-driven climate change and sea level rise. So we have a lot in common. One of the things that I want to make a matter of record here is that the Sackett case is one of a series of cases in which the Republican appointees to the Supreme Court, who I would perhaps more accurately refer to as the Federalist Society justices, have rendered decisions that are very much in the interests of big polluters. And there's an unpleasant overlap between the billionaire funders of the Federalist Society, while the lists off which Supreme Court nominations were chosen, and the billionaires who funded the ad campaigns against Judge Garland first, and then for the 3 Trump nominees, and a lot of the groups that show up in the Supreme Court to direct those chosen justices how to rule. And in this particular case, we had, first of all, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which refuses to disclose how much fossil fuel money it receives, but has become, as measured by the Influence Map organization, one of the worst climate obstructors in America, notwithstanding that is not the favored position of a good number of its members. And others included Americans for Prosperity Foundation, which is a 501c3 front group that the Koch operation, KOCH operation, runs. The state of the art these days is to have a 501c3 and a 501c4 and have them essentially be the same entity, same location, overlapping staff, board, donors, all of that. And one of them is the 501c3 and one of them is the 501c4. And those of us in politics know Americans for Prosperity, the 501c4, as one of the most aggressive and powerful political battleships of the Koch brothers organization. So Americans for Prosperity Foundation showing up is a pretty big clue as to what the Koch fossil fuel empire wants. Also, it's supported by Donors Trust, Bradley Foundation, and the Sarah Scaife Foundation. The Cato Institute also turned up, funded by the Kochs, Donors Capital, Donors Trust, Bradley Foundation. The Claremont Institute turned up, funded by Donors Capital, Donors Trust, the Bradley Foundation, and the Sarah Scaife Foundation. Liberty Justice Center turned up, funded by Donors Trust and the Bradley Foundation. Something called the NFIB Small Business Legal Center showed up, funded by Donors Capital, Donors Trust, and the Bradley Foundation. The Atlantic Legal Foundation showed up, funded by the Bradley Foundation and the Sarah Scaife Foundation. The Mountain States Legal Foundation showed up, funded by the Kochs, Donors Capital, Donors Trust, the Bradley Foundation, and the Sarah Scaife Foundation. The Southeastern Legal Foundation showed up, funded by Donors Trust, the Bradley Foundation, and the Sarah Scaife Foundation. And something called the Washington Legal Foundation showed up, funded by the Kochs, by Donors Capital, by Donors Trust, by the Bradley Foundation, and by the Sarah Scaife Foundation. And as you can see from those common funders, it's very hard to distinguish between all those different amici, and particularly because the Supreme Court didn't require them to disclose those donors and didn't require them to show that they weren't, in fact, one single interlocking group of scripted and choreographed entities trying to look independent when in fact they were all part of the same operation. And sure enough, in this case, they got what the big donors wanted. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go back just a little bit earlier in the hearing. Senator Kramer correctly pointed out that we are talking past each other on science and law. As a legislator here, along with my colleagues, I have a lot of respect for the law, which we'd hope would be the case. But I know we can't pass laws to tell water how to flow. I think we need to understand that by changing the decades-long understanding of what the Clean Water Act protects, the Supreme Court has changed the realities on the ground. Dr. Sullivan, could you just please give us maybe a couple of real-world examples of that?
Yeah, I think talking about place-based examples is important. I guess let me start at a broad scale first, though, and just remind folks that, again, that we've lost over 50% of wetlands, and so one of every two wetlands, or one of is gone, and so even at a large scale, what we see is already a reduced number. But let me take you to South Carolina for a moment, where nearly 4.6 million acres are categorized as wetlands, of which 90% are freshwater wetlands. A large chunk of the land area of South Carolina is characterized as a wetland, ranking South Carolina as the state with the third highest percentage of land area of wetlands. So it's really part of our legacy It's it's a quintessential part of the state. They support fish and wildlife, recreation, hunting, tourism, education. I work at an institute where we have a focus, partly a focus on wetlands and streams, and the educational component is critical. It's a huge tourist piece as well, a huge revenue builder. We've talked about their role in mitigating floods and clean water. So they are truly a quintessential part of our landscape, and certainly they're in danger without the safeguards, the full safeguards of the Clean Water Act. In terms of a specific example, I think there are a lot, but I think let's go to the Okefenokee Swamp for a moment, which is in Georgia. It's the largest remaining intact freshwater, one of the largest remaining freshwater intact ecosystems in North America. In addition to its ecological significance, it's critically important to local communities, supporting over 750 jobs and nearly 65 million in annual economic output per year. It's a national wildlife refuge, which is great, so it's protected, but the concern is that on its doorstep, there are hundreds and hundreds, over 600 acres of wetlands that are unprotected and subject to mining operations and strip mining. And this is a wild place. It's iconic. It's if it is one of the last remaining wild wetlands that we have, and wetlands that are bordering it are directly purifying the water. They are the source waters for the Okefenokee Swamp. And so, we're threatening thousands of species of plants and wildlife, recreational opportunities for birders, fishers, hikers, and kayakers, photographers, more and more. So that's an example. I think there's many across the country, obviously. I would encourage everybody to think about their own landscapes and wetlands of meaning to them, and understand that, not only have a lot of wetlands been lost, but most of those wetlands are likely to remain unprotected at this point.
Thanks very much. Ms. Revels, I have a question for you, if you're still with us. And the EPA has changed its regulations as quickly as possible to conform to the Sackett decision, as you know. I was surprised how quickly they did that. But they did that in order to allow permitting decisions to resume. Now we're hearing complaints that EPA may not have gone far enough, and I think these concerns miss the point. We've just had a radical, I think a sweeping reduction in water protections. And Ms. Revels, could this mean for, what could this mean for your community's questions? What could this mean for your community? Would you just give us some thoughts on that, please? Go ahead.
For my community, it looks like possibly looking like more industry coming in and destroying the few wetlands that we have left. And then those things have like a cumulative impact. One of Ms. Bodine talked about the minimal impacts. We bring industry in, and then they have all these different permits, like stormwater runoff, all these different things that impact our water. And how many cumulative minimal impacts can one community withstand, right? So it just creates a bigger, just compounds. It's like putting sprinkles on the cake. It already had the icing. It was already really good. And then you sprinkle the sprinkles, and you just add more layers to an already complex issue that is really difficult for community members like myself to even address. The addressing these things at a local level, and then at a state level, and here at DC, it becomes taxing on community members, and oftentimes outside of our areas of expertise. We know how to survive storms. We know how to be resilient. We know how to build ourselves back up, but we need protections to help us with those things. As we build ourselves up and make our communities more resilient, we need protections that are going to think about the people to come. I'm already some of y'all's kids age, and just think about my kid and our grandkids that are going to have to clean this up again. It's a reason that the definitions were amended to protect to protect communities from industry that's just dumping and just not thinking about everybody else. We can't just think about one group. We have to think about, the community members also. So thank you.
Okay, thank you there. Dr. Sullivan, another question for you, if I could. We've heard from some of our Republican colleagues that the Sackett decision aligns with the intent of the Clean Water Act. However, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned it in my statement, the Clean Water Act clearly states that, and this is a quote, the objective of this act is to restore and maintain the chemical, the physical, biological integrity of our nation's waters. Given your scientific understanding of how the health of our nation's waterways is interconnected with the health of our wetlands and our streams, do you believe that the Sackett decision aligns with the objective of the Clean Water Act? If you would just please elaborate on that.
No, I do not. I believe everything you just said is very accurate. The science, and I know Ms. Bodine has referenced the connectivity report, which is a fundamental document. I want to remind folks that almost 10 years have passed since then, and there's been a lot of work done in this field and understanding connectivity and the impacts of altered connectivity on downstream and downslope waters. And the evidence increasingly points to the critical nature of maintaining, protecting headwater streams, non-permanent streams, wetlands, adjacent and geographically isolated. So we talked about prairie potholes as an example. All alterations to these, the science is unequivocal. It is very clear what it's telling us. And I think that's one of the pieces I'm struggling with is we're talking a lot about regulation and those sorts of, which I understand, but the Sackett decision got the science all wrong. I can't say that enough. It really is not representing the science. And so to be perfectly blunt, it shows a fundamental lack of understanding of how natural waters function. That decision is counter to what we understand. And again, it's not just the connectivity report, but it's a decade of research since then that and thousands of scientists will agree with me on this, that are demonstrably showing that if we do not protect upstream, upslope waters, there are serious consequences. And I think it's, again, I'll use an analogy with our own bodies. I mean, if you go into the hospital, you get an IV, right? It goes into a small vein. Where does that go? It goes through your circulatory system, right? It's the same idea. I don't think many of us would be willing to sacrifice 10, 20, 30% of our circulatory systems and say, well, that's okay, right? We don't need to protect or maintain the health of a large proportion of our circulatory systems. We'll be fine, right? So I can't state enough that the science is clear. I do think that we are locked in a circular pattern here, and that we need to be more thoughtful in terms of rulemaking. And I'll give you a specific example, if I may. It has always been a binary, protected or not protected. Yet there are examples at the state level and others, for example, with riparian protections, not water, it could be certainly riparian protections, where it's a graded system, right? Certain waters are most protected, some are intermediate protection, some are less protected. There are more strategic ways to be going about this, and I don't think we're exploring those options. And I think we need to value the science, follow the science, and be strategic in how we proceed forward.
All right, thank you for that. I'm going to ask one more question of you, Dr. Sullivan, and then I'm going to just ask a question of all three of you to sort of close this out, please. So thank you for your patience with us. The last question I'll ask just for you, Dr. Sullivan, is we heard testimony that the Sackett does not represent a fundamental shift in wetlands protections and that there are other federal laws and programs that do protect wetlands. Would you just explain for us, if you would, Dr. Sullivan, why laws such as the Endangered Species Act and North American Wetlands Conservation Act, laws that I happen to support strongly, don't fill the void left by the Sackett decision?
Yeah, I agree those are excellent programs. They should be supplemental to the Clean Water Act. And the reason is multifold. So I'll give you an example with the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act is based on individual organisms' current status, trends, life history, information that is derived from that specific organism. So it protects habitat of that organism. Yet there are, most of those cases are going to be organisms with very limited home ranges, very limited territories, right? And as a result, the rule, that only protects that particular habitat, right? Spatially distinct. It's not something that is far-reaching. It's based on individual species, and those species, of course, are going to have their specific home ranges. And so we can think about, there are species of fish, for example, that are endemic only to, endangered species to parts of Death Valley. So the endangered species, therefore, for that particular fish, the Endangered Species Act will protect habitat in that place. We need something that covers the entire country. So that's an example. The other thing is species can be delisted, and we need long-term plans here. So we can't be, that's just, it's supplementary in terms of wetland protection. The other program is a grants-based program, and I agree, there's been some great work done. I absolutely agree with that. But any grants-based program is going to be patchy in distribution. It's going to be mediated by who applies, where they have access. Again, it's not creating a floor of protection which is needed for wetlands. We cannot afford to lose more wetlands and streams. We need a comprehensive protection, which is exactly what the intent of the Clean Water Act was.
Just a quick comment, Ms. Bodine, on the same question, if you would. Any thoughts you have, please share them with us. The question I just asked. And if you don't have any comments, that's fine. We'll go to my closing question. All right.
So I think so the question is comprehensive versus, the existence of the other programs. So you have to, the Supreme Court in Sackett interpreted the Clean Water Act. All 9 agreed that connectivity is not a basis for the jurisdiction, that significant nexus concept was not valid. We already, as I put in my written testimony, as I've spoken about today, there are a number of programs out there, and does one collectively cover everything? No, but that doesn't mean that we're going to lose the remaining 50% of our wetlands. I believe this building was built on a wetland. Certainly the mall was actually an estuary. So yes, there's been a lot of building. Maybe it's first in time, first in right, and I'm by no means saying that wetlands aren't valuable, and I agree they should be protected. But the real fundamental question is how, and should it be through various conservation programs? Should it be through cooperative programs? Should it be, or a combination of all that? Or should it be a single federal regulatory program? I mean, the Clean Water Act has lofty goals, and then it has some non-regulatory programs and some regulatory programs. So it by no means says that we're going to achieve our lofty goal with just one tool. The Clean Water Act has a lot of tools, and then the federal government has a lot of tools.
All right, thank you. My closing question, this would be for each of you. One of the things that Senator Capito and I try to do is develop consensus on difficult issues. And we've been remarkably successful, and not entirely successful, we've been remarkably successful on a wide range of issues, not the least of which is the bipartisan infrastructure law, a huge piece of legislation which has its roots right here in this room and with this committee, Democrat and Republican, bipartisan, and something that we're both very proud of and seeing it implemented across the country. My closing question would be, where do you see we've got this situation where we've had a law we've had for decades. It's been litigated. The Supreme Court has recently, with Sackett, handed down a decision that folks on our side aren't at all pleased with, and the administration came right back with out of EPA regulations to try to say, well, if this is going to be Sackett, we're going to have to live with Sackett for a while. Here's the regs we think they're consistent lineup with that decision. So my question would be this: we're coming out of this hearing today. I'm going to be here for 14 more months. Standing alongside the Christina River, which flows, beautiful river, flows through Wilmington, Delaware. A couple of months ago, I announced I wouldn't run for re-election. Had a great run in the Navy and Delaware's treasurer, congressman, governor, senator, and to serve here and chair this committee and Homeland Security Committee. I've been just really blessed. But in the next 14 months that I have here, I'm going to be looking for consensus, implementing a lot of stuff that we've authored and enacted, a lot of legislation. But I am also going to be looking for consensus maybe on some areas where we've not identified the consensus. As we've gone through this hearing today, any thoughts that you might share with us and where you think there's hope for some consensus, where we might actually work together toward actually making sure that we do have more clean water all from coast to coast in all kinds of states and situations. And one of the things that Senator Capito and I have always been trying to do, provide some certainty and predictability. I used to work when I got an MBA when I got out of the Navy many years ago and moved to Delaware, and I went to work in the Division of Economic Development for 6 months, and then got to run for state treasurer when I was 29, and I said, I want to do that. But one of the things I learned in the 6 months at the Division of Economic Development was businesses need certainty and predictability. And right now, we don't have a lot of that in the situation we're in today. So any thoughts you have about how to maybe in the next 14 months move us toward a little bit of certainty and predictability, and if there's any areas that you think where there might be some bipartisan consensus that we should pursue. And Ms. Bodine, if you'd just go first, and then we'll just ask our other witnesses as well, please. It's not an easy question. If you any thoughts you have.
This committee has had great successes working bipartisanly on bipartisan issues, and I would point out in particular that the infrastructure programs under the jurisdiction of this committee have always had very great bipartisan support. You had a great bipartisan success with the infrastructure bill from about 2 years ago, and so you may want to look at the infrastructure model rather than the regulatory model, because I think that, given how this committee and your past successes, that is going to be your highest opportunity for bipartisan agreement.
All right, thank you. Dr. Sullivan?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to comment on this. I've appreciated being here. I value all the comments from my colleagues here and from the senators. I agree. I mean, I grew up on a farm, and I understand.
Where was the farm?
What's that? It was in Vermont.
Okay.
Yeah, and so
what did you raise there?
We had dairy for a while, a long time, and then we had beef cattle, and now it's a sugar operation. But the point I'm making is I am a scientist, but I also understand the practicality around this. I understand that we have to find common ground. What I'm asking for is that we value the science in doing that. And because, as I mentioned before, you go to the physician, you want him to tell you the most current best treatment for whatever your condition is. We need to do the same thing. And Sackett has not done that. It's taken us away from the science. In terms of next steps, I gave you one before, and I'll repeat it because I think it's important. I think we've been locked in a bit of a cycle and not thinking as creatively as we can in the rulemaking process and in how we approach this. And so to repeat, at the risk of repeating, but I think it's worthwhile, we've been very binary in our approach to water protection. And although the connectivity report and our work since then has shown that there's a gradient of the degree to which upstream and upslope waters affect downstream waters, the rulemaking has still been very binary. It's been protected, not protected. Even if it's a case by case, it's still been at the end, protected, not protected. We have an opportunity to think a little differently and to understand there are models out there that let us to look at these, and this could be an area where we could get some consensus to say, can we come up with understanding that certain waters are going to be the highest protection level, some are going to be a little lower, right? We understand that. So I think that's really important to do. I also, and I wish Senator Mullen hadn't left quite as quickly as he did, because I had an important point I wanted to make, is that tribal colleagues and I have actually suggested that there be a separate category of WOTUS for our tribal nations that are informed by some of the concerns he was bringing up and that are in consultation with the tribes. So I think that is really important, that we understand and we dig a little deeper. But I do feel that we need a comprehensive, I do understand there's a lot of programs out there. I feel very strongly as a scientist, and what I see these programs doing and some of the outcomes, they're not the same as a federal level floor. And so I feel very strongly that we need to value the science, we need to respect that at the first pass, and then the second pass we can figure out effectively together how to use water in working landscapes.
All right, good, thanks. Thanks very much. I would ask our minority staff if you could just convey what our witnesses just said to Senator Mullen. I'd appreciate that. Thanks very much. Okay, Ms. Rebels, please, if you'd like to comment. Same question, we're looking for a pathway to consensus if that's a hopeless journey or if that's a man's triumph of hope over experience, that's fine. But any thoughts you have toward how we might move toward consensus on this important issue, really important issue? Ms. Rebels.
Yes, sir, absolutely. So for me, I think there's plenty of opportunity as like this is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. This is a human issue. This is an issue of us all. And it is important that we all have our human hats on and our community hats on and just always are considering the impact of those that are on the front lines. This is my life. I've gotten into this work through necessity, not because I thought it would be a great career path, right? So in the consideration, it is so imperative to have people that have experienced the things that we've experienced, like Harvey, and remembering that when we remove wetlands and like paving over wetlands, that is climate change. We are changing the climate. We are changing the plains. So like we're all human, and there's just opportunity for us to remember our humanity. You guys can always come down to Houston and just see the different demographics from 6 years ago with Harvey to today, and see what the science would say about that.
Good. Thank you, ma'am, and thanks for joining us all the way from Houston. I'm going to give just a short closing statement, and then we'll wrap it up. But in closing, again, I want to thank the three of you, each of you, very much for appearing before us today. I want to thank my colleagues who've been able to join us and participate. And even though we've got a lot going on in other committees and now in votes on the floor, but today we've heard about the scientific context. Actually, you heard about the history, and we heard about the impacts of the Supreme Court's decision to dramatically narrow the scope of the Clean Water Act. And as a matter of science, we've heard that wetlands in more than 1 million miles of streams are inextricably linked to downstream water quality. As a matter of history, we've heard that this decision reverses over 4 decades of clean water implementation. And as a matter of impacts, we've heard that the loss of protections for over half of our nation's remaining wetlands and millions of miles of stream will lead to more flooding, more polluted waters, and unfortunately harm to wildlife. Through Sackett, the Supreme Court has weakened one of our bedrock environmental laws, and the harms will be felt nationwide. I'd also like to ask at this point, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a number of letters and statements that I've received from stakeholders. These documents underscore the importance of Clean Water Act protections for our nation's health and environment and economy. This is one of my favorite parts of a hearing, when I get to ask unanimous consent for something to enter into the record. There's nobody here to object. So, and I'm not going to object to my own unanimous consent request, but without objection, all right? Seriously, though, before we adjourn, senators may submit questions for the records until the close of business on Wednesday, November 1st. We'll compile those questions, we'll send them to our witnesses, and ask our witnesses to reply by Wednesday, November 15th. And with that, again, our thanks to each of you. To be continued. Maybe I'll close with a nod to my mother. We were born in a coal mining town in West Virginia. Grew up in Danville and Roanoke, Virginia. But my mother's a deeply religious woman, and she wanted to make sure we always focused on Matthew 25, the least of these, which starts off, when I was thirsty, did you give me to drink? And so the issues that's before us I think it's a moral issue. It's something that we have a moral imperative to make sure we get it right. We've been trying for a long time. Doesn't mean we should quit now. And I have no intention in the next 14 months to, I like to say I'm going to run through the tape. Since we're talking about water here, I'll have to come up with a different kind of way of saying that, like swim through the water. But anyway, I want to make sure if we can make some progress on this front, that we do it. And if we can find some consensus and ways, provide some certainty, predictability, I'd like to do that, keeping in mind the moral imperative that we face with respect to making sure we do have clean water to drink and to live by. And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you all.